Jordan Reichert is the Deputy Leader of the Animal Protection Party of Canada and the West Coast Campaign Officer for the Animal Alliance of Canada. He's run in federal, provincial, and municipal elections, bringing a unique animal inclusive perspective to politics and social policy that puts the needs of people, animals, and the environment first. Jordan is currently employed as a mental health and addictions worker with Island Health, and he volunteers and organizes with a bunch of different organizations, including Vancouver Island Vegan Association, the Vegtoria Veg Fest, the Animal Advocacy Camp, OK B.C, the View Royal Rabbit Rescue, and the Victoria Horse Alliance. Today, Jordan has agreed to speak with us about a new international initiative from politicians and activists around the world demanding a food revolution from our governments. And thank you so much for taking the time today, Jordan.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So I'm remembering, I spoke with Liz White recently, who's the leader of the Animal Protection Party and involved with the Animal Alliance organization too, both of you. And you, the two of you, I think, went representing Canada at a gathering in Holland a couple of years ago where there were all these international animal advocates and politicians. And so I'm wondering, you know, is that the group that came up with this initiative for the governments now?
Yeah, so it's pretty amazing what's happening kind of on a global scale with the animal parties of the world. So in 2018, Liz and I went to a meeting in The Hague in the Netherlands, and we met with I think probably about 18 or 19 other animal parties from around the world. Some of them were just kind of becoming parties, and some of them had been established for quite a while. Now, this is all coordinated by the Party for the Animals, the Dutch Party for the Animals, which is the largest of the animal parties. They have over 80 members elected to various levels of their government. So I think they have 5 members elected to their national parliament, their federal parliament. They have 30 or 60 members elected to various levels like city councils, things like that. Now they have a proportional representation system there, and it's pure proportional, so the whole country votes at once, and then it's all divvied up based on like the country votes. So they get hundreds of thousands of votes in the Netherlands, and they have 5 representatives there. They also have, I think, 3 representatives in the European Parliament as well, because they get enough of the share of votes across Europe to have representatives there. So they have a representative from the Netherlands, a representative from Germany, and I believe from Portugal or Italy as well. So they've done just substantial work, and they're really the ones who, I guess they get funding to run what's called the Animal and Politics Foundation, which can put on meetings, actually gets funding from their government to build and grow the organization and their party, but also just like they can put that money towards growing the idea beyond just their own country as well. And so they host these national conventions, and it was tremendous. It was wonderful working with all these other parties, hearing about what specific issues they might be facing in their country, and talking about strategies at a global level. Now, that was the first meeting we attended. There have been more since, and kind of how it works is that, and of course this year's was canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic and such. It was supposed to be, I think, about in early June, but there's a collective or a community spirit that, even though we all are obviously different countries, many different languages, that we're all working towards a common goal, and that is to kind of uproot the status quo, kind of like it's like a revolutionary politics. It's like really just throwing the politics of today out the window and saying, this hasn't worked for us, it hasn't worked for animals, it's obviously destroyed our ecological systems that support us, and the rest of the species in the world. And so we need to do something different. And so it's really there's just this passionate dedication to creating an alternative narrative to how society can look, how governments can function, and what the world can look like maybe in the next 20 years, 50 years, etc. So what we're seeing today with the video and with the petition is kind of, it didn't come directly from that meeting, but it has been kind of an ongoing dialogue that we've been having between organizations. And it was started by, or this particular initiative was started by the French Animal Party, it's Party Animalista, and they initiated it and they did all the work coordinating everybody, which it was a tremendous undertaking to do that, because you are communicating in multiple languages with people and across multiple time zones and everything else, and all these different videos and the subtitling, and it's a huge undertaking, but we did it. And so it's a great effort to see us all teaming up on this.
It's awesome. And so the petition, which I will provide a link for and invite people to sign and tweet and share, if they agree with what it says, and we can talk about what it says. But I'm curious about the process of the petition then. So the French group wrote the initial petition, and then people translated into all these different languages. And then what's going to happen with it? Where is it going to go? To the EU, or what's going to happen with it?
Well, the idea is that is the petition. I always see a petition as a tool and not sort of the end game of a campaign, right? So the petition is to raise awareness that, first of all, a lot of people may not be aware that there's even animal parties that exist in their country. So especially Canada, which is, very spread out, and we had, last election we had 17 candidates, which was a tremendous amount of growth for us. But still, there's lots of parts of the country that don't know or haven't heard of the Animal Protection Party of Canada. And, that's similar in many other parties is that, they have maybe a few candidates and aren't able to necessarily have that broader appeal. So a petition like this, which has a national appeal to their heads of government, tries to create that awareness, but also tries to put it at a more an intercontinental, intergovernmental level, so that hopefully more people will see it as something that they can be a part of. And so the petition in itself will be used as a tool to both address directly statespeople in each country, but also to just try to raise awareness with constituents around the world that there's parties who are fighting for this, something alternative to the status quo, that these alternatives exist for them, and also that this is a small action that they can take by signing it and sharing it to support the requests in this petition, and call on their governments to take action.
Okay, well, let's talk about the petition, because it seems like, it's always a good time to understand what's happening with the animals, but right now the corporate state medias are focused on it because of the virus and because of the impact on workers, which is also a concern for those of us who are concerned about animals. We're also concerned about the human animals being forced into these environments. So what do we need to know about the petition, about what's in the petition?
So thank you so much for mentioning too, is that there's lots of marginalized workers who are being exploited during this time, especially in the animal use industries and slaughterhouses and such, where they have minimal protections, minimal safeguards for the risks of exposure. Obviously, we've seen it. The largest exposure in Canada is at Cargill and Alberta. But in the States as well, there's been mass slaughterhouse shutdowns due to the proliferation of COVID in these areas. And this is just because there's lack of education, lack of safety, and lack of kind of any sort of responsibility for these workers who are very vulnerable and terribly exploited, whether it happens in Canada, happens in the US, and it happens around the world. And we need to be fighting for them too, as animal advocates or as environmental advocates or as any individual who is concerned about this disease or concerned about sort of any social justice issues. Is we have to be recognizing how they're being exploited as well in this whole process. So thanks for raising that.
And also, I mean, I've heard there are studies that show that these workers, it's a horrible environment, and they're not paid well, and that they suffer PTSD, I believe I've heard, and that also there's a link to domestic violence. I mean, there's a lot that we already know about how horrible it is for these workers. Am I on the right track with some of that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of injuries in the workplace as well because of the really fast-paced working conditions with machinery or with knives. And of course, yeah, when you have things like, I always look at it as a balance of power, right? So when you have people who are put in these exploited situations and they're making almost no money, probably working 16-hour days, I wouldn't be surprised, in really terrible conditions, high stress conditions. They probably face deportation if they don't just go along with whatever's happening, even if they disagree with it. They have no power, right? And when you have no power, you look for avenues to express power, right? So that stress, that strain on your confinement, whether it's kind of mental confinement or physical confinement, is going to come out at some point. And whether it comes out at home when in domestic violence or otherwise, I think that certainly is realistic, or it could come out in other aspects as well. But we have to recognize that that these people are being treated, effectively the same way in many cases that we treat non-human animals. And that's part of the problem with having such a low standard for non-human animals, is that it actually sets a standard for us to dehumanize other people too. And just the simple fact that we can dehumanize somebody and treat them like an animal is terrible in itself. So, but sorry, to answer your other question regarding the petition. So the petition's kind of making demands on our governments, our federal government in Canada, Justin Trudeau, Minister of Environment, etc., that we need to take some specific actions, and that as much as the pandemic has had a tremendously negative effect on our economy, on loss of life, on our social institutions, that it's also an opportunity for us to think about how do we come out of this and make the most of this, which any government should be considering in the time of crisis. And so, because at the end of the day, we're talking about the health of people, animals, and the environment. So nobody stands to lose from these recommendations being implemented. Now, something like aiming for a reduction by 2030 to about 70% of our current animal use would be kind of just this, maybe 6 months ago, unheard of, in terms of it being a realistic project of the government to initiate in some ways. But because of the pandemic, because of the slowdown of the dairy, the beef, the poultry, whatever sectors, they no longer are producing the same number of animals that they were before. Their sales have plummeted. They can't sell the restaurants the way they did before. People aren't consuming these products in the same way. Obviously, the association between of zoonotic diseases and animals and animal consumption and the proliferation of zoonotic diseases has caused this concern in the minds of people, and I think it's become more prevalent in the minds of the public than ever before, that the way we treat and produce and consume animals is not sustainable, it's not safe, and it's not something that we can continue with in the same vein. And so all of a sudden, that 70%, right now, maybe we've cut our production and consumption. Maybe it's really hard to quantify at this point, I think, but I'd say I could at least probably say 25% pretty safely. And all of a sudden, if you don't scale that back up, you're already a third of the way there, to kind of 70%, right? You're already on your way towards maybe that 50% and then that 70%. So, and there's realistic strategies you could take towards implementing that. And it even synergizes with the new Canada Food Guide, for example, and the changes in that to a more plant-focused kind of meal plan. Obviously, the glass of milk is gone, things like that. So that's also a big opportunity. Also, implementing things that are in the petition, changing the labeling of animal products to give people a better description of kind of the life that the animals live on every product that they're buying, so that they know that somebody can't just slap, natural or humane or whatever without being held accountable for how that animal suffered, because we know one way or the other the animals are suffering in these industries. And so, make people make that count at where people are spending their dollars, right? So I think that's really important. The international transport of live animals, of course, something here that, because we transport many animals to the United States, and then there's things like the transport of live horses to Japan for slaughter as well, which has been kind of on a lot of people's radar because of the Canadian Horse Defense Coalition. Phasing out subsidies for the meat and dairy industry. Now we're kind of in this weird place, and in the UK right now, the UK dairy industry is asking for bailout money, and interestingly, the UK government is saying, well, we actually want to see you make a greater effort. They're not just giving that handout. They're saying you need to make a greater effort to find alternatives for your products in the marketplace that does exist, rather than just asking for a handout right away. In Canada, we recently, I think, committed to it was just a few days ago, I think it was about $250 million in a bailout. Now, we recently, last year, I think it was $1.75 billion to the dairy industry for changes in NAFTA related to the amount of American or US dairy products that would be able to enter into Canada and such. So there's a long history of subsidizing the animal agriculture sector here in Canada, and the Canadian government seems to want to go ahead and continue that, rather than saying, well, maybe now's not the time to continue to supply these subsidies. And furthermore, maybe we should now be encouraging them, while production is reduced, to transition off of these subsidies into plant-based agriculture instead, which really fits in with this whole messaging around the shift our society needs to take to a more plant-based society.
Right. I mean, there's lots and lots of doctors exposing the research, that peer-reviewed, scientific-based research, mountains of it now, showing that it really plant-based whole foods diet is the best, healthiest for humans. There's scientists revealing the impact of animal agriculture on the climate and the environment, the water usage, the pollution, all of that. We know that it's not good for the animals, as you pointed out, even humane, so-called humane. They may have been raised humanely, but they all end up with their throats slit, dripping blood in the slaughterhouse floor. And how do you take the life of an animal that doesn't want to die is the ultimate question there, right? So there's so many good reasons to make this shift. I'm thinking in terms of this transition. I really like this idea of assisting farmers in the transition, and I'm thinking of it in conjunction with the tar sands. You know, I know you're also concerned about environmental impact of oil and gas industry, and here in British Columbia, we're dealing with all the pipelines and all of that, and the fracking, and so you know, it seems like a good idea right now is a perfect time to transition all these workers who are stuck in these old industries that really aren't serving us, that are destroying us in one way or another. And so does this petition then how, you know, how specific is it about how we're going to transition the farmers, or how do you think the government should help these farmers move, and what would the crops be and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we really need to, think about this strategy as something that's not just, yeah, absolutely, as you mentioned, not just focused on meat and dairy, but the fossil fuel sector, the mining sector, forestry, the fisheries. All of these sectors need to be reworked because they're based on like an old sort of mentality that the earth will just infinitely provide a bounty, for us, and we can just keep taking as much as we want, and then you merge that with capitalism, and you get the absolute collapse of our ecological systems, because we find out very quickly that no, nature cannot replenish at the rate that we exploit it to make ever-growing profits. And so, a fundamental part of this should be a reconsideration of our economic system in tandem with how we are reframing our actual sort of exploitative industries, whether it's environmentally exploitative or animal exploitative. And so certainly, yeah, with farmers, is it that we want to see production of legumes, because, legumes are used in a lot of the plant-based alternatives that we see right now, whether it's, peas or chickpeas or, anything kind of in that spread. Is that going to be the direction we go in, or is it going to be oats? And for the dairy industry, is it going to be wheat? Because obviously wheat is used in a lot of the production of alternatives as well. Or are we really going to say, like, let's not focus so much on sort of synthetic foods, or sorry, not synthetic foods, but processed foods? And do we want to really be promoting, whole plant-based foods as much as possible, right? So one of the biggest things right now is that it's more expensive to buy healthy, especially organic, non-GMO vegetables than it is to just buy cheap vegetables or cheap meat or dairy products, right? And so that's a really difficult barrier for a lot of people to eat healthy, is the cost, right? Do we need to tax meat as a part of that? Do we need to tax dairy products because of the downstream negative health consequences that they impose, and that we all end up paying for through our healthcare system related to these products? So, we have to rethink how we do these things. And the same with the fisheries. And the problem is that it's not just these issues just aren't social, and they're not just political, they're also geographical. So it's very difficult. For example, right now on the West Coast, we see like a proposal for a harvest of seals and sea lions, pinnipeds, by basically herring fishermen. And salmon fishermen, because there's been this transition for them of the government saying, the herring fisheries have collapsed, the southern resident killer whales are, their population is obviously endangered. We have to take some action to limit these exploitative activities on the marine environment in this area. Now, for them, that's, a really difficult situation because they don't necessarily know anything else, right? So for them, they say, well, what else can we effectively, if we can't catch, herring and salmon, then what can we do? Oh, well, there's all these seals, which to them are considered pests. And maybe we could start a business sealing, basically. And so they're trying to put this proposal forward to the federal government, the DFO, that we can to start a seal harvest here. And they want to start by killing 50,000 seals and sea lions by reducing the population in half. And so you see that geographically, they're sort of trapped in that they don't really know what else they can do because, they're coastally situated in more remote communities where there's not a lot of opportunities for other businesses to arise. Maybe there's opportunities for ecotourism to be developed, but there's probably limited number of jobs in that area as well. And so we really have to be mindful of how is the government going to subsidize and transition people in these more rural or remote communities that rely on extractive resource extraction industries to sustain themselves, because it's not fair for us, as much as we want to make these positive changes, to go in and simply wipe out people's livelihoods. We want to be compassionate to their experience, to their their desire to live meaningful and fulfilling lives as well. And so that may mean making sure that they have access to retraining resources, educational resources. Maybe it means buying out the contracts that they currently have, so that they have money to sustain them, or to offer them resettling kind of funds, so that they can, if they decide that they no longer want to stay in those areas, they can relocate. So we really have to think of it from a very kind of holistic perspective, and not just leave people out of the equation while we're trying to protect animals and the environment from what people are doing. Because in many cases, people they're just doing their job. They don't necessarily think about the larger consequences it has on society and our ecology. So that's very important.
Yeah, and I'm just reflecting. I had this really cool conversation yesterday with a friend of mine in New York City who I went to high school with. And, when the virus hit New York City, and I was thinking, geez, do I know anybody in New York? And I remembered my friend, and I reached out, and it turned out he was sick at home with the virus and has since recovered. And we graduated from high school in 1979, so we're in that demographic. And so I was very concerned about it. I was writing to him every day. Well, we've become friends over again as a result. And we were chatting yesterday, and so I was catching him up on my life. And I've switched careers a number of times, it turns out. I hadn't kind of realized until I looked back on it. And I think maybe, this is a really nice opportunity for people who, they love being out on the ocean, as you say, and we don't want to deprive or say what they should be doing, but maybe now's a good time for people to make a list of what else would you like to be doing, and how could the government support you. I would certainly get behind that, a government that's helping people. Yeah, it's really unfortunate, but you're not going to be able to do this anymore. What else do you want to be doing, right?
Well, that's the beauty. We always, it's funny because, that's sort of, we always, or people who kind of operate within the animal use framework often diminish the qualities of animals, or kind of essentialize them as just being like they're just kind of, they objectify them, and they don't have any sort of meaning or ability to operate outside of one mode of existence, right? Like if you're a cow, then you're just a cow, and that's it. What more could be interesting to you besides eating, sleeping? There's no real, they give no value to their existence, right? But then we end up kind of trapping ourselves in many cases into these same narrow confines, that our existence just has to be one way, that there's only one thing we can do. We identify with that, and nothing else could really be the way that we exist. You know, a dairy farmer couldn't be anything else but a dairy farmer. A fisherman couldn't be anything else but a fisherman. You know, so these are the types of things that we, as humans, we kind of pride ourselves on our creativity and our adaptability, and yet when it comes to kind of our personal experience, we often we try to almost try to ignore that and say, well, no, there's nothing else I could do. This is just who I am and how I am, and don't ask me to change. But that's exactly what, you know, being an animal, being a human animal is all about, is adaptability and creatively expressing oneself in a variety of ways. Anyway, yeah, so I absolutely agree with you. And you even look at something like the fossil fuel industry, and comparatively, the sustainable, renewables industry employs far more people than the fossil fuel industry, and yet we're so dedicated and entrenched in that. But why aren't we investing and retraining people for the renewables industry instead? And I'm sure there's tons of people in those fields that would be happy to, you know, retrain and just have a job and go work and be paid well within the renewables industry. And also, I mean, imagine being a part of that industry with a society that celebrates what you're doing, rather than constantly in conflict with society over what you're doing and its impact on you know, the local environment and the rest of the world as well.
Well, I think, you know, this virus is teaching us so many things, and the first lesson is that we can adapt to change. We can do it when we have to do it. We can do it. And the other thing is, you know, that now there's massive flooding in Fort McMurray. You know, it wasn't so long ago they had those huge fires raging through. I mean, if I was living in Fort Mac, I'd be looking for a way out for sure, you know. And then, of course, there's the impact on all the First Nations who are downstream from that. And a lot of them have sort of embraced the tar sands money as well, because they're impoverished and it's a way. But I think in their hearts they really are land protectors, and you know, the ecotourism, I think, is a really another thing I'm thinking about, Jordan, is that the virus is teaching us is how valuable nature is. You know,
Yes.
who hasn't gone for a walk in a park and then felt, oh, thank goodness this park is here, because otherwise, where would I go? You know, so I think as we emerge from this, ecotourism is going to become a huge thing, and people already flock to BC for that. So, yeah, the time is right before this transition, and for the governments to get involved in the transition. The other people who can get involved in the transition are us. I really believe in the power of supply and demand. The idea that, you know, as we stop purchasing meat and dairy products and start purchasing organic plant products with the money that we save from the meat and dairy, which is quite expensive, if you're buying, you know, the choice cuts or whatever, that there's going to be a natural shift as well. So I believe in that power that we as consumers have. And then the other piece is the farmer corporations as well, who I'm guessing they're making it's a profitable industry, or they wouldn't keep doing it. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on that, and if you think, like, what role do you think the corporations should have in transitioning as well? Should the government say, look, you have until this day to do this, and this is you have to get this done and this done, or do you think it should just be a natural progression, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple of things there to unpack, certainly. And so, you know, first of all, your comment about that it's on all of us. I think one of the biggest problems we have in our political system is that, you know, even people who really value the vote, they take that vote, they give it to a politician or a political party, and they say, there, you know, that's my involvement in making the world the vision that you lay out in your platform, right? I'm just going to go back to work now. You fix everything. I'm out, right? And that's not the way our politics should work. You know, we have to be engaged and be political ourselves, because every action we take, whether it's for what we want or just kind of or against what we want, is political. And that's what in the petition as well, it says, like, you know, it is on us as well to take action as individuals, for our choices, whether it's the consumption of animal products, you know, whether it's driving vehicles, you know, everything that we do, we have to be more mindful than ever before about how our choices impact, you know, the lives of others, whether it's animals or humans, or whether it's the environment. And we have to start seeing ourselves as a part of that political establishment, because I tell you, politicians get just free reign almost to do whatever they want, because they're not held accountable for their own actions, let alone the actions that they sort of enable through the policy they make. Because at the end of the day, you know, very seldom is there anybody saying, well, you know, I'm changing. And the problem is, if you don't change your behavior, then you really don't internalize it. So next time there's an election, you're more likely to fall for the same kind of rhetoric of the political parties that make all these empty promises or sweet nothings, and then end up doing whatever they want once they're elected to power. We saw this multiple times in the last couple elections. And so you know, as towards the corporate perspective, is that I think we need to look back to the bailouts in 2008 of the big banks, the big auto industries, you know, and just, you know, because billions of dollars were given and nothing changed. You know, nothing changed. Here we are over a decade later, and it's just business as usual. It's still a race to the top of the profit margin, and that just is not sustainable. And it's landed us back in the same place before. The same types of trade wars are going on. The same type of economic hardship is being felt by the vast majority of society, while the rich continue to get richer. The disparity of wealth has only continued to rise. And so where's the accountability for that? The governments right now, while these corporations are actually, you know, in a very strange place, because they want those bailouts again. But interestingly, and we kind of, you know, you mentioned this before, is that the government's actually doing a decent job right now of making sure that people can sustain themselves. It's almost a bit of a basic income type experiment that's taking place right now, and it's kind of exciting in that sense. I think at the other end of it, we'll kind of be able to examine what actually happened and whether it had a valuable contribution. Now, there aren't the same type of opportunities for people to go find employment if they do want employment. So that's and they can't, you know, even the education system is different right now. So it's a lot of uncertainty. So it's not an ideal kind of environment for the experiment. But still, I think there's a lot of opportunity to gain insight into the benefits that may be reaped from it. Certainly, I think the benefits to people who are generally very marginalized on EI or welfare or disability, who, you know, barely get enough to survive month to month, them being topped up, I think, is something that we need to keep in place, and ensure that they have a higher standard of living, higher quality of life, and they've been kind of forced into by the government in many cases. But for the corporations, going back to that, is that there's this opportunity to say, yeah, you know, maybe now is the time for us to start holding them accountable for what they do with that money. A bailout should not just be a handout and a promise that will always just be there to lift you up if you keep people employed. It should be, well, yeah, you know, the employment is great, but the way you're doing things is absolutely unsustainable. And we need to see substantial changes in how business is done. And so we can kind of add regulations or add maybe there needs to be some legislative changes, but add some regulations as to or stipulations as to what that can be done with that money, where it can go. If it's paying to make sure CEOs are topped up and their bonuses are cleared for whatever, then that's obviously not where that money should be going. Making sure that employees are people can maintain their employment obviously is very important. We can't have all the businesses shutting down and people being left without jobs when on the other side of this, that's hugely important. But we also can't go back to business as usual in terms of the exploitative industries in terms of the environment, animal agriculture, yeah, whether it's pipelines, any of this type of thing. So now's the time for a shift. We just need that political will, and we need people. And it's difficult because it's a really difficult time to bring up these issues because a lot of people are dying, a lot of people are suffering, a lot of people are fearful, and so it's a tough conversation to have. But it's one that needs to be in the minds of people of how do we come out of this with a healthier, stronger, more resilient society that doesn't end up in the same place again or the same place we were in 2008 again, because as much as this is a larger economic disaster than 2008, if the 2008 disaster happened next year or something again, that puts all those people at risk again. It puts the world in turmoil again, and it's not something that we have to go through. We can do better with our systems.
Absolutely, and the other thing, I'm the wording from the petition that I pulled out as well says the world has known other epidemics of animal origin such as SARS, MERS, pig flu, bird flu, mad cow disease. 3 in 4 new human infectious diseases come from animals. So this isn't necessarily, we don't know if we're ever going to get over coronavirus at this point, and we don't know what's coming next. So I do agree with you that it's hard when people are dying, people are sick, you can't even say goodbye to them. But it seems like it's also such an opportune time to take that anger and that frustration and channel it into this change that is beneficial on so many levels. And I really appreciate that you spoke about the universal basic income aspect. I used to work with the street community, publishing the street news, and I'm inspired by what I'm seeing. Suddenly they have become important. Their health affects our health, and so they're important, and they're getting housed, and they're getting topped up. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that, but just first I'd like to mention that for people who don't understand what happens, now I understand what happens. I have $2,000. Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. I argue with him in my head about a lot of things, but I'm thankful certainly for the way that this is financially being handled for the most part. I have money to buy my vegan, organic plant food and feel healthy. I'm not totally stressed. I know there's an end to this. I know something's going to have to shift in my world, but at this moment, I'm okay. I'm okay for this week and next week and the week after that, and that's a huge burden lifted. I can donate small amounts to my favorite animal sanctuaries so that some of these animals that aren't going to slaughter can get into a sanctuary and live the rest of their life safely in the way that nature intended. I can pay it forward. I can buy products from some of my favorite local places online. Last night I had a feast of a lotus pond with some neighbors outside in their backyard safely. So I think that that's what's keeping the economy going is putting money in people's hands and letting us carry on with keeping the economy going. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but also in terms of the street community, and that, you know, now they're shifting people into the big arena. I'm thinking these people are sleeping better probably than they've slept in a long time. They're allowed to have a stable-ish environment inside their tents. You know, I know a big part of the hassle of being on the streets is you can never get out of the cycle because you're constantly having to pack your stuff up and carry it from place to place, and you're getting moved along. There's no showers, there's no, well, now they've got all of that and they've got support, and it seems that there's care and concern. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments about either of those things.
Yeah, definitely. So, first of all, you're absolutely right that ensuring people have that money in hand just relieves a great deal of stress. And I mean, if people didn't have that money in hand, I can't imagine what society would be like right now. There'd be just destitution and poverty all over the place. People would be walking away from their homes. They'd be losing their homes. I don't know. I guess they'd be begging in the street, like, for food, and it would just be there'd be crime all over. People wouldn't be able to function, and so they would do what they needed to survive. And forcing people into survival mode in as wealthy of a country as we are in Canada would just be kind of unconscionable, especially when we know the government gives billions of dollars to these the corporations all the time. And so the fact that they're actually finally investing in the public directly, and then the public can choose to spend that money to sustain the economy as much as possible is profound. And I think it's just I applaud Trudeau for the calmness and the I guess just the attitude with which it has all been taken, that this is a social responsibility to take care of everyone. I have a great deal of respect for how it's been handled. Even Dr. Bonnie Henry, of course, as well. Just a vision of stability and strength in our community right now, and that's what we need. I feel terrible for the Americans in what they have to deal with Trump. I can't even imagine having a leader like that. But so we should consider ourselves very lucky, regardless. And yeah, Lotus Pond, they said it's the busiest they've ever been and they've been open since I think 1998 or something. So in over 20 years, this is the busiest they've ever been during a pandemic when nothing's open. And you see how people are celebrating that in a way, right? And Fern's doing good business, and the Very Good Butchers are doing very good business, and all these businesses are doing good business because the local communities are supporting them. And I think that's fantastic. Now, when we look at the other aspect of what you were saying, I think that sorry, can you remind me exactly
about the street community?
Yeah, the street community. Sorry, yeah. So, I mean, I've worked in mental health and addictions for over a decade, 11 years now, and it's a complicated situation. I've watched from the sideline, or I've watched as a frontline worker for years of people being underserved by the resources available. Effectively, what we have is an increase in management culture rather than an increase in actual supports for people on the ground. So, in the last 11 years, there's been barely any new beds, for example, opened up for treatment, and yet the number of people seeking treatment and the amount of pressure on that system has probably gone up tenfold. Similarly, the counseling services or psychiatric services, psychological services continue to be absent. Psychiatric services are still available to medicate people and such, but there's very little resources for people to actually gain kind of mental health support and also get the treatment that they need to get out of the addiction cycle in those cases. Now, of course, homelessness isn't always associated with addictions, but there's a high comorbidity between them, and along with mental health. And another part of that is that we see the government. So I remember a couple of years ago, provincial government said they were throwing $75 million at the opioid crisis. And I mean, here, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly where all that money went. I know that there were a ton of naloxone kits purchased, and training was done. And so those became kind of mainstream in the community, and even, broader society as well. People started carrying them around in their glove compartments or whatever. But in terms of addressing the source problem with like housing, I'm not sure that much ground has been made in that area. And when I look at what's currently happening, it's really interesting how the crisis can cause all of a sudden the shift when it actually poses a threat to, the rest of society, in terms of like a health risk, or maybe a social risk, because, I know a lot of people felt like when I was hearing from a lot of people that when they went downtown, they felt like the only people they saw were people who were probably street entrenched, or actively using and such, because a lot of businesses were closed otherwise, right? So it was really interesting, I think, just how I guess explicit the homelessness crisis and addiction crisis we have in this city, and probably all around the country and the world, became when it was kind of laid bare, because these people had no place to go self-isolate. These people had nowhere to stay home, as everybody was saying. Now I think that it's admirable, kind of the effort that's being made, because I think it's kind of a last minute sort of like, oh, we need to do something about this. They started at Topaz Park, the tent city there, and that has, as much as it's been probably good, it's also highly problematic, just taking a large group of people who are experiencing homelessness and addiction issues and throwing them all just into basically a confined area, because you're saying like, this is kind of what you need, this is your area now, right? And then even housing people like that, it raises the same problems as if you're just going to put them all into one hotel. It just ghettoizes, it just creates these problem, quote unquote, areas that people don't want to be around, and they end up pointing a finger at and saying, well, that's where the problem is again, rather than providing like housing and services and support to people that is much more kind of dignified and respectful of maybe their individual needs. Because when you just put them all, when you take all those people and just put them, you're saying, well, you're all the same, just throw you in one place, because you're all just doing the same thing and have the same problems and needs, and so it can all just be solved there. But what we've seen is that that's not effective, right? We've seen it when what they did at Tent City previously, that was at the Law House lawns, and ended up moved to Johnson Street there. The same problems arose, and still exist, because not a lot has been done there. And we keep on just creating shelter beds and things like this. So anyway, I'm concerned that this is just a stopgap solution by the government to kind of make sure that again, people experiencing homelessness are not seen, and that they can be hidden to some degree in a condensed area. And then once things kind of subside, they just kind of slowly dissipate them back into the community, rather than providing them with the actual housing and services and supports that they need. I'm not saying that they're not going to do that. I'm just saying that I'm concerned that we'll just see a repeat of history, and a lack of long-term support for them.
Well, when I published the Victoria Street News for 10 years in this town, we really tried to look at the systemic, like, why do we, in such a wealthy nation where there's such a gap, why is there such a gap between the rich and the poor? And yeah, you can build a shelter and put them inside for a little bit in the winter, and that's great, and we have to do that. But it's really a band-aid on a huge gaping wound. And so now it seems like we're seeing there's huge gaps in this system. And you know, the welfare rates haven't been raised for, I don't know, 25,000 years or something. Like they're
Yeah, most people, I think it's like $700 a month. I don't know how anybody can live off $700 a month. And it kind of goes to that. I mean, there's a flip side, right? So is that right now the government's handing out a lot of money to people, and a lot of people who are you know, actively in addiction or homeless. You know, if you give somebody $2,000 a month and they're used to getting $700 a month, and you're not providing them with like the support they need, or if that's not staggered in some way, you just give people thousands of dollars. You know, there's a reason why you know, Welfare Wednesday is considered like Mardi Gras in some circles, is because the money goes by the end of the weekend and it's gone, right? And so you're giving thousands of dollars without any direct, like, you know, not that you can control how people spend their money, but at the same time, that's a lot of money and opportunity wasted if you don't have something more structural in place to ensure that it's actually bettering their life and not just digging them deeper down that hole of addiction. So,
right. Like if you could take that $2,000 and find somewhere to rent with it and get yourself inside, and maybe sign up for a course and try to get back in terms of your self-esteem and how, you know, I was really admirable of, I don't know if it's still running, they used to have a free university program, Uni 101 and 102 and all that. And I know people who went through that, and it didn't change their world in the, you know, in a huge way, in that they wanted to change their lifestyle. But people who live in subsidized housing, for example, and you know, and they're delightful people. They just don't kind of fit the mainstream groove. They have their special quirks or whatever. They're not necessarily addicts or anything, but they're special people, right? And they do good things. They go to local meetings. They, you know, I can think of one guy, and he goes to the community meetings at our place, and he, you know, tries to keep involved. And he's 70 years old now, and he took this Uni 101 course, and just his whole world opened up in terms of understanding history and, you know, other societies, how they work. And it was just really great for his self-esteem and his confidence, and his world expanded in terms of friends and networking and all of that. So yeah, you're right. You know, you can't just throw money at people. At the same time, you can't just not provide anything, because so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I really hope that, you know, I know this is a part of the Canadian Animal Action Party. Am I got that right?
Animal Protection Party of Canada.
Animal Protection Party of Canada that's also a part of the mandate. There is looking after somehow eliminating this huge gap between rich and poor.
Well, you know, you have to, I think, you know, a part of our plan is guaranteed basic income, absolutely. But also, you know, looking at our economic system, we're the only, you know, we're not the only, certainly, but we're one of the few parties, and probably one of the more mainstream parties, even though we're not mainstream, we're definitely on the fringe in terms of our exposure anyway. But is, you know, looking at, you know, a steady state economy, like restructuring our economic system to not be exploitative of workers and labor, and ensuring that we commit to a better spread of wealth in our society. It's not just done through making sure that you have a guaranteed basic income. It's done through changing employment standards, you know, making sure that people who are working are getting paid a fair, decent wage, that they have access to resources and benefits, that they have access to education, that education is something that is free and accessible to people as well. You know, education, you're absolutely right, is that one of the things we invest in least is empowering people to meaningfully participate in society. What we often do is say, you know, we just kind of set the bar at being a productive member of society, not a member of society who feels that they have a place or that they can have the ability to participate fully or express themselves fully in society, but just a productive member of society. And that can be extremely debilitating to people in terms of their participation and in terms of their mental health and just social well-being, is when you just feel like you're a cog in the machine. It's depressing, and it's you know, makes you not want to participate, and it often leads to things like you know, addiction or other issues. And so you know, education, I think, is probably one of the most powerful tools we have, and it's vastly underutilized in our society because it is largely inaccessible to people without the means to participate in it. And that's why removing that barrier is you know, should be an essential part of you know, the future of our society, whatever that looks like right now. And you know, COVID, especially now, I mean, now is just one of the biggest opportunities we have, because you know, you look at universities right now and they're saying in September we're not going to be going back to classes for undergraduate degrees or to like in-person classes. Masters and PhD programs likely will be going back because there's much smaller groups of people who are engaged in the institutions there. But for undergrads, they're probably doing their classes online. Like, is that's a huge opportunity. Now, of course, many people may not have access to the resources to computers and Zoom and even maybe have good working knowledge of computers and stuff, but I bet you there are a large number of people that could benefit from those classes, and the cost for them to participate in the classes is, I mean, I imagine almost negligible at this time if it's spread out over the breadth of courses offered, because you have this, because of the online sort of mode of education. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities there to get more people who otherwise wouldn't have that opportunity engaged in education and re-education for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, I try to keep on the bright side of things and look at this opportunity and this UBI experiment, and also the experiment of staying home, you know, and the old adage is that, oh, you just give people money and they're just going to sit on the couch and smoke weed and watch Netflix all day. Well, you know, maybe we do that now and then, but ultimately we want to be productive members of society. I mean, that gets old really fast. I think we've all learned that. We want to be doing something. We want to be out and engaged. And so a UBI would give people the opportunity to maybe, you know, oh, I've got some old computers. I could help teach some of these people how to get online. Like, they could use their time in a way that they feel is productive and that's supporting the community that they live in, rather than maybe being forced into dangerous work environments doing things that they don't really want to do. So I'm hoping that we can take some of these lessons and move forward with it. I'm curious, so you mentioned that there's 17 candidates ran across Canada last election, in the federal election.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was involved with the Green Party at its grassroots, and it's so interesting because a lot of what you talk about is a lot of what they used to talk about. And I'd love to see a coalition. You know, I respect now Pierre Trudeau and the Liberals more than I did. So I'd like to see you guys at the table, more Green
Justin
Party,
Trudeau?
some, who did I say? Did I say Pierre again?
Yeah, Pierre.
Oh, I always say that.
No, that's okay, yeah.
I'm a child of the 60s, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, the NDP. And so we can have lots of voices and discussing this and coming up with different ideas rather than this sort of majority-minority thing. So you mentioned proportional representation. And so I'm wondering a couple of things. I know you're in favor of that. I know the party's in favor of that. And I did talk to Liz about that. But now, one thing I forgot to ask Liz about, I remember with the Green Party, they were trying to get people elected one reason was across Canada, because then once you get a certain number of people elected, I think it is, or a certain number of votes, then you get some government funding. How close is the animal protection?
Yeah, unfortunately, so that did exist in Canada. I think it was the threshold. Well, I think just once you were elected, so once you had a member elected,
Okay.
You got $2 per vote.
Okay.
So, you know, not a small amount of money if the Greens, for example, I don't know, I can't remember how many votes they got this past election, but 11% of the vote or something like that. And so, I mean, that's a substantial, it's probably a couple million votes or a million votes or something like that. And so, you times that times, that's a nice little amount. For us, but what happened is, Stephen Harper axed that during his term. Yeah, so it no longer exists, and I don't know if the parties have a will to bring it back. It again, like if there was proportional representation, I'm sure something like that would be reinstated because it makes sense within that framework to ensure that there's somewhat of an effort being made to even the playing field for those involved. But when and there's an interest in multiple parties to have that even playing field. But when you have a first past the post system, what interest is there in having in the most powerful party subsidizing the smallest party, right? Because to them, if we got elected or if the Greens being elected, it's really like it's just a pain in the butt for them to deal with. They don't want to hear that kind of like that voice in their head saying, on their shoulder saying, well, this is really bad for the environment, and just to have that critic at all stages. And that is the problem with our political system, is that because it doesn't reward anything except for status quo politics, parties like the Greens, which as you mentioned, traditionally were more left-leaning, I think, have tended to try to capture more of that centrist group of voters, and their policy has shifted, and their way of speaking has shifted, and their principles have shifted. And
the NDP, I would add.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Totally different. I mean, Jack Layton is totally different than Thomas Mulcair to Jagmeet Singh. And like, where do we go from there? We can't just keep going down that path of everybody moving towards that direction. And so I think that we have to recognize that proportional representation solves so much of the inadequacies of our political system that lead to the faults of our social policy, our environmental policy, etc. And until we address that, I can't really see a substantial shift in how we do things in Canada. I think we're much closer to it than, say, our friends in the States are. I think they're just not even on their radar. But here, because we do have a diversity of parties elected, especially with the Bloc Québécois gaining substantial traction again, the Greens finding one extra seat, I think, and there being more of a balance between the NDP and the Bloc, I think there could be a bit more of a will towards proportional. But again, if all it takes is one election, and with the Liberals gaining a majority or the Conservatives gaining a majority again, and we'll see where we go from there. But the two most interesting things probably happening in terms of politics are the election of the Conservative leader and the election of the next Green leader, because that will largely determine the trajectory of Canadian politics. Are we going to have a strong left voice in the Greens, or are they going to continue down that centrist path? And then are the Conservatives going to find a leader that's more charismatic than Trudeau and can convince Canadians that they should be the voice again, which would be, I think, just a disaster for this country. But anyway, however it goes, we're going to continue to work on our end through the Animal Protection Party to grow get more, environmental and animal advocates on the ballot across in more cities across the country to represent the values of people who are just sick and tired of the status quo and want something different and want change to come from the crisis that we currently face and want change to come from the climate crisis, which has been largely ignored since the emergence of the pandemic, and it needs to be still in the minds of people at this time. So we're going to continue doing our job in holding all those other parties accountable, and hopefully one day we'll have the opportunity to sit in Parliament alongside them and hold them accountable in there as well.
All right. Well, that seems like a great place to end it. I will provide links for the Animal Protection Party and the petition. And thank you so much, Jordan, for taking the time today. And
thank you, Janine.
On just a final note, we are entering a new world, a brave new world, whether we like it or not. And the young folk who are all over the climate situation, we're going vegan in droves even before this. That's where I get my inspiration and hope. I assume that's similar for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to see the young people coming up, and I think in the next 10 years or so, we're going to see so much leadership as they transition into adulthood. And but that youth voice is always so powerful, and yet unfortunately it sort of inspires people, but it's something that I think just the general population are inspired by it to a large degree. But politicians, it's always a double-edged sword, because it's they love to show up and be in the crowds and get the selfies and be kind of those the groupies in a sense of the youth. But at the same time, when it comes to taking action in our legislature or in our parliament or on our city councils, they often do not walk the walk, and they let a lot of them down. And so that's why we need those youth to not lose heart in our systems and to stay vigilant, even in the face of disappointment and of disregard in many cases by politicians, and become those politicians in the years ahead, because there are, as my friend Ned Taylor, I think in Saanich, and as one of the youngest politicians, he's done a good job. He's only 19 years old. He's just it's great to see young people being involved in politics and bringing new fresh perspectives, because I've watched on city council in Victoria just how much these status quo politicians that have been there forever, it seems like, hold things back from changing for no other reason than nostalgia or just their own really biased views that aren't supported by the evidence. So hopefully we'll have a new era ahead of us to look forward to in a reasonable amount of time. 10 years isn't terrible. I hope we have I hope the world can still be saved in that amount of time.
Let's hope for that. Okay, and we'll all get on board. And thank you again, Jordan. Take care of yourself, hey?
You too, Janine. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
All right.
All the best.
Yeah.